Good morning. This is Richard K. Munro and the Richard K. Munro Show. And what we plan on doing is talk about news of the day and for part of the day, and then culture and reading for another part. So some things will be linked to current events and others to themes that could be for any time, for all time, eternal themes. I think both are important. We need to be aware of what's happening. And I see here that stocks sink and dash inflation hopes. So we still are bedeviled with inflation. U.S. consumer prices increased sharply in August from July after excluding volatile food and energy prices, showing that inflation pressures remain strong and stubborn, even as the year-over-year increase was slightly slower. And so this is amazing. When President Trump finished, inflation was about 1.2%, and now it is 8.3. It was 8.5 in July, 9.1 in June, and that's tremendous. And so I don't think that there will be any decrease in inflation soon, and it could go up again. So we'll see what happens, but certainly it's important. And related to this is energy prices. And when you look at global energy costs and all the problems that we have, to me, there's no question that we have to seriously think about having nuclear energy as a centerpiece of our energy stability for production and for prices as well. And of course, it's hard to believe. I mean, outside of the United States, nuclear energy is entering a golden age. And China has built over 225 plants. And costs are driven down to affordable levels. And they're planning on delivering 5 cents a kilowatt compared to 14 cents a kilowatt in the United States. And of course, this new technology is going to have low waste, fourth generation. And so these nuclear plants could possibly produce 20, 30, 40% of the energy needs in the world. And so, despite all this, in the US, nuclear energy has essentially been abandoned, with 2 exceptions. We have utility operators working through supplemental license renewals, trying to extend the life of the existing nuclear fleet, such as Diablo Canyon in California. That it was set to close in just a short while, and they're going to keep it open for at least 5 more years. But the outlook for nuclear still is brutal. In the last 25 years, the U.S. has put exactly 2 plants in service: Watts Bar 2 in Tennessee and Vogtle in Georgia. And once again, China is opening up 225. But at the same time, we have retirements setting in. So power generation through nuclear is expected to decline by 40% by 2015 if nothing is done. Right now, it's about 20% of all electrical production, and it'll decline to 12% or lower And it's amazing to think about this. There's a wonderful article in the Wall Street Journal about our friendly neighborhood nuclear reactor by Mark Nader on September 13th. At the St. Michael Archangel School, students like me were rarely reminded the nuclear reactor was humming nearby. But we did have periodic evacuation drills. Adults loaded us onto buses in the middle of the day, drove us south from Munro, Michigan towards Ohio. No one ever told us what would happen after we arrived or what to expect if disaster struck. After a 20-minute ride, we simply circled back and returned to the school. Local kids called the Fermi 2 nuclear reactor the cloud machine. Its billowing steam constantly drifts over Lake Erie. Compared with the coal-fired plant nearby, nuclear plant feels futuristic and clean. Since coming online in 1988, Fermi 2 has produced 200 billion kilowatt hours of carbon-free electricity. It currently employs about 850 people. The thing about living near a nuclear reactor, especially in a place where there are never hurricanes and where tornadoes and earthquakes are rare, is you don't think about it. The plant sits next to Sterling State Park, a popular place to swim in the summer. Residents are far more concerned about the lake's algae blooms than they are about radiation, though you can see the towers from the beach. But naturally, everyone jokes about kids growing gills and catching three-eyed fish. The level of trust Monroe County residents have in nuclear reactors is surprising, considering the first year Fermi 1 suffered a partial meltdown on October 5th, 1966. Fermi 1 was a breeder reactor, temperamental design that, when working properly, produces more fissile material than it consumes. That incident caused 1% of the fuel to melt. Emergency shutdown ended the crisis after 20 minutes, with no serious injuries or radiation leaks. Munro is about 30 miles to the south of Detroit. The meltdown inspired a 1975 book, We Almost Lost Detroit, very hyperbolistic, and a 1977 Gil Heron song of the same name, meant to terrify listeners. After the incident, a joke went around that someone had knocked a beer can into the reactor. In 1968, engineers determined that a zirconium plate originally installed as a safety measure had broken loose, causing a partial meltdown. Fermi 1 was closed in late 1972, when planning for its second iteration was already underway. After the 3 Mile Island in 1979 and Chernobyl in 1986 and Fukushima in 2011, you think that residents would have clamored to close Fermi 2. But apart from occasional dust-ups with activists about waste storage or bogus cancer rate statistics in the surrounding area, there isn't much noise about shutting it down. The first reactor safety systems worked, and the second are expected to. Rising global energy costs and questions about the reliability of wind and solar have produced new moment for nuclear. Governments considering keeping the nuclear power plants operating or adding nuclear to their energy mix should know it is inevitable that a new reactor will provoke local opposition. Even a small meltdown didn't prevent Michigan down from embracing the future of clean energy. And that's the thing about nuclear. It is clean energy. And it all comes down to scale. Small is good for marketing in a risk-averse world, but nothing can change the fact that our national interest in electric generation is large, especially if we must double to support the electrification of transportation, as argued by Elon Musk. So if we want to have electric cars, I don't see how we can have electric cars, thousands, millions of electric cars, without improving our electrical system and without improving and adding our nuclear capacity. So if we're serious about producing massive clean energy, it'll be cheaper to build new energy plants throughout the states than doing it. And of course, once again, if nothing else, moves us as a nation, the massive Chinese nuclear building program is a wake-up call. Once again, over 200 new nuclear plants, and in the last 20 years, we've started 2. In 30 years, we'll pass from being a nuclear leader to nuclear irrelevant. And so it's very, very important. So there's no question we have to think about that. How about some news from Ukraine? When Putin invaded Ukraine in February, it looked as if the country was doomed, that their economy would be destroyed, all the businesses would be destroyed, and there'd be no recovery. But here we are in September. And Ukraine has apparently defeated the Russians in the field. We don't know how that'll end up. But more than that, the economy in Ukraine is rebuilding. Ukraine's equivalent at Nova Poshta, the equivalent of FedEx, deliveries are back up to 90% of their pre-war level of 1 million parcels a day. 90%. When Russia invaded in February, Nova Poshta's revenues fell to 2%, and the co-owner, Mr. Klimov, thought that his company would disappear completely. But as spring progressed, e-commerce and business activity resumed in a way from the front lines, and many factories switched to supplying the military. It means that we're actually profitable and have some money for future investments, he said. So Ukraine's economy, while hurting, is stabilizing after a deep crash set off by the war. Thanks by a combination of quick policy decisions, military resilience, and a flexible response of Ukrainian businesses to the damage and dislocation. The uptick is boosting morale in the country, along with recent combat breakthroughs in the east after months on the defensive. Earlier this year, the Russian forces threatened the capital of Kyiv. It looked like Ukraine's economy might collapse, with the gross domestic product for the year predicted to fall as much as half. Still expected to be down by about 30%, but summer saw a rebound from the depths of last spring. Things are bad but stable, said Timothy Mikolanov, head of the Kiev School of Economics. It looks and feels like the economy is adapting. A major factor is military. Russia's retreat from the area around Kyiv, slow progress of its subsequent offensives, Ukraine's recent counterattacks have created enough certainty for economic activity to resume in the unoccupied part of Ukraine. The Ukrainian army's success in recent days, moving Russian forces out of the eastern Kharkiv region, has shown how Ukraine has seized its strategic initiative, raising hopes that more territory will be liberated before winter. If you're 50 or 100 kilometers from the front line, there are missiles, but you don't feel the Russians will be here tomorrow, said Mr. Mikolanov. Ukraine's central bank also took swift steps using a playbook drawn from earlier crises to help prevent a bigger disaster. The National Bank of Ukraine imposed capital controls and pegged Ukrainians' currency, the hryvnia, dollar to levels that allow import costs and inflation to skyrocket. The bank had to devalue hryvnia in July when it came under too much pressure, but the new rate has held so far. The central bank printed money to keep the government solvent at a time when international markets wouldn't lend, tax revenues were evaporating. Beginning of the war, we understood it was impossible to conduct our monetary policy as before, said Sergei Novalchuk, deputy governor of the National Bank of Ukraine. The government temporarily slashed taxes. Russian efforts against vital systems such as banks and the internet have been ineffective and have continued to function. You know, one of the smartest things that Zelensky did was to take Ukraine off the Russian electrical grid and put it on the European electrical grid. This makes it much more difficult for the Russians to disrupt all of the energy of Ukraine. Russian bombs destroyed most of Igor Lysky's wood processing factory west of Kyiv this spring. He decided to rebuild it as an example of resistance. They'll be operating at full capacity by the fall, he said. I believe victory will depend on the economy, said the 43-year-old. Ukraine needs companies to give work, pay taxes, export products. All companies that can should produce. Despite the recent gains, the economic blow has been severe. Russian troops have seized some of the heartlands of Ukrainian industry and agriculture, blockaded the Black Sea ports Ukrainian exports rely on, and bombed factories, oil refineries, and other infrastructure. Millions of Ukrainians have become refugees inside the country and across Europe, and unemployment is slowly declining from a peak of 35%. Russian missiles continue to strike, and winter will bring new difficulties, including sky-high cost of heating and fears of natural gas shortages. In recent days, Russian strikes against power stations, which have caused temporary outages in several cities, are a warning that Moscow will target Ukraine's electricity and heating infrastructure. Ukraine's Western allies, especially the European Union, are lagging in sending promised financing for the government. They became dangerously reliant on money printing by the central bank. This contributes to inflation of over 20%. It's crucial for the resilience of Ukraine that we get funding that was committed from our international partners. So Yuri Vitrenko, chief executive of the national oil and gas company, Naftogaz. The determination not to go under is evident across the country. Motivation and truth are on our side, Mr. Liskey. If we survive on the economic side, definitely we will win the war. So the story of Mr. Liskey is very interesting. He built his first business in Luhansk in eastern Ukraine. He lost them all in Russia's covert invasion in 2014. He moved to Kyiv and built new ventures in industry and agriculture, ranging from wood processing to honey making. His company, a private equity fund called Effective Investments Groups, uses foreign capital raised from Europe and North America. He's pitching a proposal to the government for an insurance fund involving international insurers that protects investments against military risk to spare rebuilding despite the continuing war. Ukraine's economy suffered a deep depression in the 90s after the collapse of communism. Later, a shock set the country back from the 2008 global financial crisis to Russia's 2014 seizure of Crimea, part of Ukraine's east. Ukrainians watched while neighbors such as Poland and Romania joined the EU and grew rapidly. Ukraine's aspirations for deeper economic ties with the West and resistance to Moscow were the causes of the conflict. Ukraine's economy was improving before Russia's invasion this year. Many Ukrainians say the latest economic shock is still better than the one in the 1990s, when employers couldn't pay wages and mass hardship swept the country. Many also say the experience has created a mentality of inventive self-reliance. There it is. The one advantage Ukraine has is to have free enterprise and inventive self-reliance. These are things that Russia doesn't have or understand. We are well trained in recovering from all types of crisis, said Marily Messili, a shoe designer from Kyiv. We specifically switched from designing high heels to army boots. The factory she works with in Kharkiv was bombed. It's restarted production in safer western Ukraine. Currently a refugee in Amsterdam, she has carved out a new export market for her fashion brand, Marsala. The invasion threatened to cut off Ukraine's access to gasoline, diesel, and crude oil, which came overland from Russia and from Belarus, a Russian ally, or from the blockaded Black Sea. Russian missiles also destroyed Ukraine's main oil refineries and a major fuel depot. Executives for Ukraine's gas station operators, led by major networks Akko and Vog, travel frantically around the EU, buying up new supplies of gasoline and diesel. They had to pay cash up front, sometimes a month in advance, to European suppliers that didn't like the risk of dealing with the country being invaded. Importing fuel by train was difficult because Ukrainian roads have a wider gauge than the EU. At the Polish-Ukrainian border, fuel had to be siphoned out of European standard trains and pumped into Ukrainian wagons. It isn't easy or quick, said Vasyl Danielak, CEO of Akko. In April, Ukraine imported 200,000 metric tons of fuel, compared with 1 million tons before the war. Mile-long lines of cars were common sight at Ukrainian gas stations. The government relaxed fuel price controls to help importers cover higher logistics costs. Gas station networks bought fuel from all over the world except Russia. By July, imports were back to 770,000 tons. Fuel companies operate without large depots because of missile attacks. While it's less than $3 million of gasoline in any one place to keep the target's value below the cost of Russian missiles. A deal brokered by Turkey to reopen the Black Sea for limited grain exports, giving partial relief to Ukrainian agriculture and world food markets, although Russia has threatened to curtail the shipments. Heavy industry is still struggling without sea access. Ukraine's biggest steel plant, the ArcelorMittal steel plant in Kryvyi Rih, is producing about 20% of its pre-war volume. The mill has switched to sending steel westward to the European Union via road and rail. But without ports, it can't import enough coking coal to Kryvyi Rih, limiting how much iron ore it can produce. If you saw one bottleneck, you found another, said Mauro Longobardo, an Italian who heads the Ukrainian operations of the Luxembourg-based multinational. Low volume and expensive logistics mean the plant is losing money. It's cut wages and already cut jobs, which does improve. If we reduce people, this city hurts like hell, he said. The gritty steel town of Kryvyi Rih, about 40 miles from the front line fighting in South Ukraine, holds symbolic importance for both towns. It's the hometown of President Zelensky. The steel mill helped defend it early in the invasion when the Russian army column came within less than 10 miles, but giving the Ukrainian army several giant mining trucks to block the road. The Russian armored vehicles couldn't use the soggy ground around the obstacle, came under fire and retreated, a strategic setback. Service sectors are faring better despite challenges. Nova Poshta, as I mentioned, is struggling through gas shortages. In Kharkiv, Russian shelling killed people queuing the bench for humanitarian packages. Sorting centers in Kharkiv, Cherniv, and Mykolaiv have been bombed. We began rebuilding sorting centers within hours. Now you can't see the damage, Mr. Klimov. Out of 30,000 pre-war employees, about 2,700 have joined the military. The company laid off about 1,500 people, mainly in Russian-held areas where it can't operate. Signs of recovery in Ukraine's job market soon began after Russian forces retreated from Kiev. Vacancies in Ukraine's biggest employment website reached more than 40,000 on a given day in August, compared to 6,000 in March. Compares with more than 100,000 vacancies in February before the invasion. Vacancies show the geographic shift taking place, said Arthur Mikino, Works CEO. Jobs are being created in Lviv and other cities in the safer West. Work in the tech segment, Dnipro, the industrial center in central Ukraine. Other IT clusters emerge in Kiev and Lviv. Exports of IT servers up 3% compared to earlier figures. We're at war with a country with nuclear weapons, and companies are still able to grow their business. Before the war, Petro Harav's main business was the 84 asparagus farm in southern Kherson region. Russian troops now occupy it. Some Mr. Harav's workers now are refugees in Europe, and others are in Kherson but uncontactable. He's wiring them their salary using the firm's financial reserves and the profits from 2 cafes he opened this year in Dnipro. He's donated body armor, helmets, medicine, and 2 cars to the army. He firmly believes that Kherson will be liberated and he will see his farm again. On a summer in Dnipro, Mr. Harav's cafes were lively. Young people drank and talked on the waterfront until the midnight wartime curfew. The city of more than 1 million people on the Dnipro River has suffered less bombing than others near the front, become a haven for many displaced people. We're trying to live a full life, said Mr. Harav. Everyone wants their life back. Among the Soviet-era high-rise blocks of eastern Kyiv, Maxim Pukov is rebuilding a food kiosk business he lost to Mariupol, the port city destroyed in one of the most brutal episodes in the Russian invasion. After fleeing Mariupol with his wife and son reaching Kyiv, Richard said he shut his eyes and tapped his mobile phone's bank app. Opening his eyes, relieved to see his bank was still working and all his money was still there. He decided to open a new shawarma kiosk in Tuchinska, a working-class suburb of the capital. All their employees are fellow refugees from Mariupol. We didn't wait to see something to happen. We decided to act. The outlet took off, and Pukov is expanding a second. His ambition is to build a new chain across Ukraine. So what this tells us is, with Nova Poshta and all these new entrepreneurs, new businesses beginning, all of the online banking and working, it is a different situation from one that would have happened 50 years ago. 50 years ago, the Russians could have cut off all the electricity. They could have cut off the banking. They could have isolated everybody. They could have disrupted the economy completely. But now they can't. The economy of Ukraine is too flexible and too resilient for them to be controlled. And of course, we can't discount the tremendous patriotism of the Ukrainians, the sacrifices they're willing to build for their nation. So I'm reasonably optimistic that Ukraine will be free, and that it will come out of this a stronger and more unified and more prosperous nation than ever. The real dangers, of course, are as if any of the nuclear plants in Ukraine, if they're destroyed somehow or sabotaged. And of course, we have to live with the reality: would Putin actually use tactical nuclear weapons? And if he does, nobody knows what will happen then, and that certainly is a risk. But for the time being, the things in Ukraine seem to be better than ever.